And Meet the Member podcast, the Member Stories podcast. We've got a very special person on with me today called Alex Hammond. She's been a member since about 2009. She has been a real kind of glue to the membership at Wandsworth. She'll explain a bit in a moment about how she came into Wandsworth. But from my perspective, often, it's not been plain sailing all the way through one element. And it's lovely when I turn up at training and I see old friends and I see people who lift the spirits and they get out whatever the weather. And we had one likely amusing story about Alex is when we were back in 2010, we were looking to rebrand the whole model, get a new logo, and really understand what the business was about. And I think we might be going through something similar soon. But at the time, we got a branding business in. And I think if you bear in mind, these people normally work with sort of shoe companies and juice companies and that sort of thing. They came and they talked to us and they said, well, what we need to do first off is talk to your members and talk to your trainers and talk to anyone who has anything to do with the business and understand what the business means to them. So they asked for a series of numbers. I gave them every number I could come across, I could think of. And they came back a week later, having done a lot of work, called up all these people and had long chats with them. And they sat down in this office in Temple and they said to me, I don't think we have ever come across a group of people who are so linked into the brand, so attached to the brand. It means so much to them, which was really nice to hear. But then they said one story, which was there's one lady who will not leave the area that she lives in Wandsworth because she doesn't want to go away from one element. And I knew in a moment that was Alex because she had mentioned it before. But it's very touching that she did that and said that, and it had a lot of input into the way that we developed the brand from there. Alex has come on to talk to us about a couple of stories. And what we're going to do is try and normally do one story, but Alex has got two really interesting stories that we're going to try and cover in this 35 minute chat. One is about a health condition that has come on recently, and we'll go into that in a second. And another one is about this sort of superwoman work that Alex does for the NHS as head of sustainable procurement. So an extraordinary, and I'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. But without further ado, let me introduce Alex. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, Thomas. I'm still here, whatever it is, 14 years later. So yeah. Still living in Wandsworth because of what I'm in.
Yeah, and you're there every week, and with your husband now, and your boy comes along in the bike. So it's a joy to see you and all of you now at training. So Alex, let's start with the recent condition. You've recently been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Just to be clear for everyone, that means you don't produce insulin as opposed to being insulin resistant, which is more the type 2 diabetes or adult onset diabetes. So type 1 is where your pancreas isn't working or doesn't work properly. And this happened to you, 18 months ago? You tell us. Yeah. You tell us the story, please.
Yeah, I'm an unusual case with type 1 diabetes. It's a condition that many people get when they're young, as young as sort of infancy and childhood. And I was diagnosed just after I turned 40, so a little surprising. And yeah, it's been a real shift and change to my mindset and my perhaps my mortality a little bit. But I think I've learned what I need to do to not just live with the condition, but thrive with the condition. And so, yeah, it's definitely been a shock and took some recalibrating of parts of my life. But I'm now in the sort of living with rather than adapting to.
Yeah. Interesting. So could you just give us we've talked about this before, but could you give us a summary of that sort of period of time when you started presenting with symptoms, and then how those symptoms presented, and then eventually how you went and got your diagnosis and all the things that go through our minds? I mean, even if we're perfectly well, we're constantly thinking that something might be just around the corner.
Yeah. Definitely. So this was in late 2020, late 2021, I started to not feel very well. And it wasn't all the time. It was, I would say there were episodes of being really fatigued. I would be so tired that I wouldn't even be able to get myself as far as my bed or even the sofa at times, and I would just fall asleep on the floor. And we couldn't really assign any rhyme or reason to this at the time. My husband, my friends, we were all sort of trying to analyze the different things that had happened. And it probably happened every, I don't know, sort of 2 to 5 weeks. So there was no kind of regular cycle to it. And anyway, it was really bewildering. But I didn't have what you'd sort of consider the typical type 1 diabetes symptoms, which are being thirsty all the time, wanting to urinate a lot. Those things just didn't manifest in me, and I was concerned with how I was feeling, but also like many busy people, I put it down to what it could have been. You know, we were still in lockdown, and I have 3 kids, one of whom was 3 at the time, and so I thought it's just stress. I'm tired. And my mom came to visit at Christmas time, and she said a couple of things to me that really motivated me to take action. I was a little bit, well, I know now in hindsight that I was really worried, but I didn't really want to take the plunge to go and see the doctor. And I think about this, and actually it was probably 8 months that I wasn't very well before I actually went and saw my GP. So what really got me moving on that was that I was with my mom, as I said, and she said to me, you're a little off, are you okay? And I sort of went, oh yeah, I'm fine, no big deal. But it sort of got me thinking, like, oh yeah, maybe other people are noticing this. It's not just me. And then she made a remark in sort of in jest, but she said, you're just at that stage of life where you can't die. You've got too many people that depend on you. You're too necessary. And I would argue that that's always the case for anybody. That there isn't a good time to die, but it really shocked me, because I thought to myself, it helped me kind of process and realize that I was worried that I was dying. I was worried I had something terminal, and that I was going to be, if I went to the doctor, I'd have to face that. And yeah, so that's where I sort of, how I got myself into actually seeing a GP and getting the diagnosis.
That's fascinating. It's I may be using completely the wrong analogy here, but it's like the Schrodinger's cat, isn't it? If you don't know what's in the box, it doesn't really, like, you don't think it's neither dead or alive. Whereas if you open the box and go to the doctors, then you get one of the 2 answers, or you're definitely going to get an answer, but what that is. But yeah, I mean, I imagine finding that out wasn't kind of on the script.
Well, so I, for those that know me, I'm not a natural worrier. I'm a little bit like, everything's going to work out in the end. But what I realize now is that I did have a list of things I was worried that it was. And so when I went into the doctor, I had a very young GP. I saw a very young GP who was a bit scared of whatever it was that I was presenting with, because he just had no idea. And so he just ordered every scan, every blood test in the book, and so I got a full health MOT at the same time. And what I realized, well, what was kind of silly about this whole situation is the most simple blood test would have told me exactly what was going on, and it was less than 24 hours later that the more senior GP called me and said, hey, do you know that you have diabetes? And I at that very moment, I realized that this just wasn't on my list. I had a short list, I had a long list, I had 10 other worries that I had all sorts of, I thought I had terminal cancer. That's what I thought I had. I mean, perhaps we all jump to that conclusion when we don't feel well. And so, but diabetes wasn't even on my radar. I had no concept that this was even a possibility. People don't get type 1 diabetes. Well, they do, but it's unusual to get it at my age. And what was also interesting was at the beginning, they couldn't tell me if it was type 1 or type 2. Now, I'm active, right? I've been doing One Element since 2009. I'm not I have a good diet. I'm not the age or the demographic that would normally present with type 2 diabetes. But for a little while, I just didn't know. So it was really disconcerting. And I think having the diagnosis in some ways was a relief, because the NHS is incredible. I mean, I was called on a Tuesday at 3:00 by the GP, and at 9:00 on Wednesday morning, I was in St. Thomas's at the diabetes type 1 clinic, learning how to take insulin, learning what this all meant. I at that point didn't even know what type 1 diabetes really was, or what caused it, or why this might have happened. I still don't quite know why it happened. So yeah, it was a whirlwind time, but hugely, in a lot of ways, I feel incredibly grateful that I know exactly what's wrong with me, and I know exactly how to manage it, and it's up to me to do those things. And so, in a lot of ways, as shocking as the diagnosis was, it was also, it filled me with gratitude that I knew what was going on, and I could start to solve it.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely can understand that and appreciate how much that must have meant, that moment of realization. And actually, this is something that you can manage and can take forward. But I'm prone to saying the wrong thing and making gaffes and asking stupid questions. So I will stick with that characteristic of mine. But so just for a sort of beginner's guide on insulin, as far as I'm concerned, and type 1 and type 2 diabetes, your pancreas produces insulin. Your blood sugar, or rather, let's start at the beginning. You eat a big bowl of spaghetti bolognese or a Mars bar or something like that, and you get a spike in blood sugar. The sugar is absorbed through the lining of the gut into the blood, and through the lining of the mouth and into the blood sugar. You get a huge spike in blood sugar. You then release a dollop of insulin into your blood that essentially grabs that blood sugar, or glucose or glycogen, and stores it into your liver, into your fat, and into your muscles. So it pulls it out of the blood, brings your blood sugar back to a normal state. That's for most people. However, if you've then got two outcomes here, one is you're not producing the insulin, so you're just maintaining a very high blood sugar, especially after eating a lot of sugary food. And the other one is that you're type 2 diabetic, which means you become insulin resistant. So the insulin you're producing just does not get the sugar out of or the glucose out of the blood. Now, what I'm interested with you, Hamo, is the kind of effects, and correct me if I'm wrong on that little explanation, but the effects of high blood sugar and what that makes you feel like. And then I'd love to go into low blood sugar or hypo and hear about what that makes you feel like. And if there's any way you can explain for myself and anyone who's still listening, what that feels like.
Well, first of all, an incredible explanation as to what type 1 and type 2 diabetes are. And I think one of the ongoing frustrations I have with this diagnosis is the lack of knowledge, and it's not anyone's fault. I was absolutely not clued up on this before my diagnosis, but the lack of knowledge of the differences between type 1 and type 2. I should say as well, just connecting back to what I said before, one of why I was having those big bouts of fatigue, finally eventually realized was that they were linked to those days where I was having that Mars bar, that bowl of spaghetti, or the high carbohydrate, fast acting carbohydrates in the system, and that was giving me these almost putting me almost into a sort of catatonic state. And it makes sense now with the diagnosis. And so essentially what I was experiencing at those times was hyperglycemia, which is very high blood sugars. And my body was unable to produce the insulin it needed to then balance out those high sugars. And I think what is interesting for me is that actually I still have my pancreas is still working a little bit. We don't really know exactly how much, but I'm on quite low doses of insulin, and somehow those episodes didn't land me in hospital. I mean, that was the direction of travel I was going on. Absolutely. If I had not had that little shock to the system and gone to the GP, I would have eventually presented in hospital.
And also, I mean, I may be wrong here, but also because I know you have a good diet, you don't eat too much sugar, but you also exercise. So in some ways, you're burning that blood sugar off a lot. I mean, you're cycling to work, you're coming to one element training, you're doing a lot of kind of low rate exercise as well, lots of walking, picking the kids up, that sort of thing. So you're burning off that blood sugar all the time.
100%. That's been a huge part of my ongoing management around type 1 as well, is that part of the reason I don't take a lot of insulin is not because I'm not a diabetic. It's that I manage my blood sugars through exercise and activity. And I'm starting now, 18 months in, to be able to know when I need to take insulin and when I don't. So for example, on a Saturday morning, when I wake up and go straight to one element session, I have my long acting insulin. So there's two types of insulin you take as a type 1 diabetic. There's long acting, which you take regularly, no matter what you do, when you get up and when you go to bed. And then there's fast acting that you take when you have a meal. And normally I would have fast acting insulin before breakfast or before a meal. And I know with one element that I can't take any fast acting insulin before a big session at one element, because I will definitely go hyperglycemic, and that is hypoglycemic, sorry, which I can talk about in a second if you want. But absolutely the ability to exercise, to manage through diet is really empowering, actually, because it sometimes feels like I've kind of cured myself of diabetes because I take no insulin in the day. Haven't, but it does sort of, it does show that actually the decisions that you make as a diabetic are very much linked to how dependent you are on the medicines and the treatment.
Yeah, and it gives you some control back. It gives you that ability to control the condition, which is so powerful, isn't it?
I mean, just on that, I think there's something that happened to me sort of personally and psychologically around this diagnosis. For those that know me and have known me through my life, my family, my oldest friends and things, this was not just a kind of, wow, this is bizarre kind of health thing that's come out of nowhere. And if somebody had to describe me, it would just have, like, in one word, nicely describe me, maybe not, they wouldn't always use this word, but they would just say healthy. Like, I've always been healthy, right? I've needed almost no medical interventions through my whole life. I had a really easy pregnancy. I bounced back. And so for me, psychologically, this was really challenging, because suddenly I wasn't healthy, and I have a chronic lifelong condition that makes me, that some people qualify as a disability. And, and I really had to kind of sit with this, and it didn't always make me feel very comfortable. I mean, that was probably the hardest thing about this, was that sort of shift in my self-perception. Am I a healthy person, or am I an ill person? And the control I get through diet and exercise over type 1 diabetes helps me so much in knowing that I am a healthy person. I have control. I can manage this. The ball's in my court as to how much I let this condition impact my life. And I don't think I'll ever be free of it. Maybe, research and development will make that happen one day. But what it does mean is that I get to be back in the driver's seat, and that's really powerful for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight. Do you feel like you're even healthier now as far as your food and movement, or just
in a lot of ways? Yeah, I mean, I'm
more aware.
I definitely eat fewer simple carbohydrates, and when I do, I really enjoy them because I kind of know this is a sort of a special moment. The one challenge about diabetes, and this is probably a little bit counterintuitive, is that drinking alcohol actually brings your blood sugars down. You wouldn't necessarily think so, right? You hear about how much sugar there is in alcohol but actually the effects of alcohol bring your sugars down. So there is a bit of me that is like, when I'm drinking alcohol, I'm like, oh, but I can eat that hamburger bun because I need the carbohydrates to counteract that. So sometimes it leads to slightly less decision making, but overall, I think definitely, it's given me it's made me realize that my body can't process sugars. Even none of our bodies are really designed that well to process sugars, but mine's designed even less well. And so, when you see a kind of like a big slice of cake, you just think like, oh, actually, I feel like I'm kind of poisoning myself. So not that I don't ever eat cake, because that would be just a tragedy.
No, brilliant. Fascinating. I learned something new there with the alcohol brings your blood sugar down. I had no idea about that. You're right, completely counterintuitive. Well, I think we'll move across now to your work, and I just to introduce your work briefly. So, head of sustainable procurement for the NHS, or head of procurement for the NHS with sustainable hat on. Just to give a background on this, the amount of emissions within the entire UK that the NHS produces is 6%, and you're in charge of within that 6%, 4% of the entire UK's emissions. So an enormous role to have. And so, what I'd love to hear is, how long have you been doing it for? When did this work start? And was it at the same time as the diabetes and stuff? And also just a little bit about this role, this extraordinary role that you have within NHS.
I've just completed quite a busy week of doing this role, and it sometimes doesn't feel very extraordinary. It feels a bit of a slog. But thank you for reminding me that it is actually a really important job that we're doing as a team. So I joined this. I work for NHS England, so I'm head of sustainable procurement for NHS England, and my team and I set the policy direction for sustainable procurement for anything we buy within NHS England, and also the wider NHS. And it's a big challenge. Where do you even start when you look at what the NHS buys? I mean, with the small exception of weapons, the NHS buys just about everything. And so, if you try to sort of start at each and every product or each and every type of thing that we do, I think it overwhelms and becomes just too big and scary a problem. So my role is really about taking the big picture and making that sort of achievable for our suppliers and for the people in the NHS. So I set we have what we call the net zero supplier roadmap. So it's our kind of plan between now and 2030, and it has specific milestones, so specific times where suppliers need to do certain things. They need to have carbon reduction plan. They need to tell us their emissions for their products and services. They need to tell us about their use give us information about social value in the procurements that they do. And that then sets a really clear agenda for not just the suppliers, but also for those who are doing procurements in the NHS. They know exactly when they need to and when. And so that's sort of my role.
So it's not so much that you're going and finding the hypodermic needles and making sure that they have exactly the right. You're creating a framework that people have to conform to be able to sell their products into the NHS. So just rewinding quickly, if you don't mind. Firstly, what were you doing before that? How did the NHS manage to find you? What were you doing before? What?
Well, it actually coincided with when I started One Element. So I came down to London. I lived in Edinburgh previously, and I came down to London to do a job in the hospitality industry, doing sustainability. Sustainability has always been the common denominator, right? That's my professional area of expertise, and I was doing that job, but it was right as the financial crisis was happening. The writing was on the wall, that what I was doing was just not going to be the priority for this hospitality company. So I got a job at Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals in central London, and as their head of sustainability. And through that role, I started with the really practical stuff there. We needed a strategy. We also, I also had people saying, well, it's ridiculous how much packaging there is involved in this, this procedure, and we need to do something about that. So it was a very hands-on role as well as a strategic role. Probably at the beginning more hands-on than strategic. And so I learned a lot about, the practicalities of delivering this. And then I did that role in one way, shape, or form for about 10 years. Different I had slightly different roles, but I was involved with Guy's and St Thomas's and sustainability, leading that for about 10 years. And then I worked in Guy's has a commercial arm, so I did consultancy. So I was working with 50, 60 NHS organizations across England, Wales, and Scotland, and supporting them to get their sustainability strategies sorted, to make sure that they're decarbonizing their estates, and got very involved in procurement as well. So procurement is not my my specific area of focus until this role, which I've now, like I said, been in for just over 2 years. So yeah, it was a bit of a journey. I think the NHS is one of the most incredible places to work, and one of the most frustrating places to work. So it's one of those things where if you can stick it out and you can, have patience with the system and how it works, it can be the most rewarding job in the entire world. And I maintain, I really look forward to somebody presenting me with a job that I can do next. I mean, I will have to do another job someday that would have more impact. When you say that about, my team is responsible for 4% of the UK's carbon emissions. I mean, that's massive, right? Yeah, I could go and work for a pharma company and get paid 3 times as much, but where would I have that impact? So the NHS, for so many reasons in my life, employment, health-wise, is just the most incredible institution. And I think we need to.
But it also sounds like you've got real meaning and purpose around it. What just wanting to come back to, because you mentioned sort of legislation, and I know we've talked before that you also write legislation for things around slavery and working slavery and so on. And you go and you spend a lot of time at the Cabinet Office and trying to build that relationship and actually writing all the legislation within that. So some fascinating stuff there. But on this, I'm really interested because my old man was a medic, and he used to work at a local hospital near where we were brought up in sort of West Sussex. And it was interesting. I was talking to him this weekend about it, and I mean, we've just got a couple of piglets at our house, and I was mentioning this to him, and he was saying, "Oh, we used to have pigs at the hospital, and they would eat." It was a bit of a geriatrics hospital, and they would eat all of the food that the geriatrics didn't eat. So that all of anything left over would go to the pigs, and then the pigs would probably end up being, well, definitely would end up being slaughtered and then being eaten by local people, or perhaps even go back into the food chain around there. But he said it was extraordinary. The person who reared the pigs said they were the best tasting animals he had ever eaten. But the point is that we now can't do that because of all this legislation. And, a lot of these medics, maybe not when my old man was a medic, but beforehand, would have reused a lot of the tools that they were using at the time. They would have washed them and cleaned them and polished them. And a lot of that doesn't happen anymore. And so, what sustainability, talk to me about sustainability and what it really means and what it in essence is.
Well, so, at its core, sustainability is about using resources wisely, right? Like that's what it is. So the argument that it costs more or that it's somehow, a kind of nice to have add-on is actually, I think, only when we think it through quite poorly and not thoroughly. So part of what my team does is finding good opportunities to scale up activities like sterilization of instruments. We just published a surgical trays rationalization how-to guide. So it sounds really exciting. It is actually really cool. So my team went into operating theaters and talked to the surgeons and talked to the people I actually don't remember the exact title, the very, very clever people who actually hand the right instrument to the surgeon, and sat them down and said, what do you use? What instruments do you use? What do you not use? Why? Let's optimize this tray so that when you do go to sterilize it, actually you're not sterilizing 60% of the instruments were never even touched. And actually you're sterilizing the instruments you actually need. And so there's a huge movement, and it's often led by clinicians to return to some of those really sensible principles around just delivering better healthcare and more sensible, more person-centered healthcare, and not just for the patient, but also for the people working in hospitals. What worries me about the NHS at the moment is we're COVID has hit our operations so much that we actually, the bandwidth people have for thinking outside of the box is limited. But you would be, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but I'm always inspired by how many people are still coming to us day in, day out who join we have a sustainable procurement forum made of clinicians, sustainability people, procurement people all across the NHS. They come in their droves to our events and they are supportive and they're flying the flag. So sustainability in the NHS is so many things. It's our suppliers sorting out their own operations and their manufacturing and so on. It's making sure that we are, eradicating the modern slavery in our supply chains. That's a part of my job I didn't mention, but we have to really set that into legal terms this year. And then it's also just about the practical day-to-day delivery of healthcare. And so it's really rewarding when you get that right. And I think we don't always, but we often do.
Fascinating, Alex. One final question, without wanting to ask you to mark your own homework, how are you getting on? How do you think? Because it's not just about what you're doing. It's about, or maybe this question is about what you're doing, but like the wider question as well of how is this government, or rather, let's not get political. How are we getting on, or how are you getting on with it? Do you feel like it's being picked up and run with, this ball?
Yeah. So the UK was the first health system to set a net zero target, which we did in October 2020. And since then, dozens of countries, including the US, have set a net zero target and a plan around that for their health systems. And so there's huge interest in what we're doing internationally, and even the work that we're doing on some of our work with suppliers. We've got Cabinet Office watching us closely to see how it goes, letting us be a bit of the crash test dummies. But I think that there's a lot of appetite for the work that we're doing. I think at the moment it's not getting a lot of airtime because we've got a lot of other things that are in the news. But it doesn't. With the we're seeing so many things where climate change is undeniably with us. And this is really, I think, for us as a program, health and the climate are inextricably linked. And so as an organization in the NHS, there's huge dedication to making this work. So it doesn't always feel it day to day, but I think overall we're winning.
Yeah. If you could go back to October 2020 or the week beforehand, you would see big changes. Massive changes. That's really that is really uplifting from my perspective, and hopefully the people who are listening, just because it feels like at times with the coverage that we're not going in the right direction. But it's nice to hear that you are, and hopefully we are more of a nation as well. But Alex, unless you've got anything else you want to add, I just want to say a huge thanks from me and everyone who listened for telling us your stories. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, just thanks. The thing that keeps me sane day in and day out is my lovely times with One Element. It's a special part of who I am, and helps me get all these cool things done.
Thank you. And you're a huge part of One Element, you know that. So I'll look forward to seeing you out on the paddock tomorrow morning for a training session. Okay, many thanks, and hopefully see everyone else soon. See you for the next one.